In the last video, we stood up a local Kubernetes cluster using Kind, deployed an image to it, and connected to the pods from localhost. And now I'd like to take a look at some of the CD tools like Flux and play around a bit. And Flux allows us to automate the rollout process by having any changes to our Kubernetes config be automatically picked up, pulled in, and rolled out. At a high level, Flux sits inside the cluster and monitors the configuration repository for changes, and as they happen, just automatically handles them and rolls out the new implementation, handles the new configs. For this demo, I'm going to use the same repository as last time. What we'll do is we'll bootstrap Flux into our cluster, configure Flux to monitor our repository for changes, and we're going to bump a new version number, and then we're going to monitor the rollout of that new Docker image. This isn't the only way to do this, or even necessarily the preferred way. Flux does have a tool for image scanning that monitors your image repository for new versions and then does the config updates for you. But for now, I think the manual change works well because we get to see everything that's happening and there's no magic happening. We get to see what's going on under the hood. So it allows us to walk before we run. And what I'm going to do is walk through the getting started docs and highlight through this process where we are along the way. So that way it all makes sense. And I've already created a new branch to start working on. The first thing that we're going to have to do is bring up the Kind cluster and load our image into it. And those are things that we've already done from the last time. So let's bring up the cluster. Okay, and now the cluster's up. Let's load the image in. To do this, you do have to have the Flux CLI installed. I already have it installed, so I won't be doing this step. The next step is going to be once this image is loaded in, we can check our prerequisites to make sure we're ready to move forward. The first step that we're going to have to do once this is loaded in is bootstrap Flux into the cluster. And so what this is going to do, what this command will do, is create some config files that Flux uses to bootstrap itself into the cluster, and it adds them to the repository and then bootstraps things for us. So let's do our check first. Looks like prerequisites are all there. And with that, we can start to bootstrap Flux into the cluster. Now, I have my own configuration that I'd like to use instead of theirs. And it's pretty similar, but it's just pointing to this repository as opposed to the ones that they recommend in the getting started docs. So for me, it is we're using the repository of Kubernetes Kind demo. That's the repository we've been using. We're going to point it to this branch, the Flux demo branch, so we're not pointing to main. And the path that we want these new YAML files to live in is going to be clusters / simpleGo - cluster. That is pretty similar to their example here. So we'll run this and we'll get to see what it's going to do. Okay, so what the first thing it's doing is it's adding these manifests to the repository and pushing them up to GitHub and then bootstrapping itself into the Kind cluster. If we look at our repository, we should see these files inside the Flux demo branch. So here's the directory that it added. And then here are the YAML files that Flux is adding to Bootstrap itself. And these are all managed by Flux. So at this point, there's nothing we're going to need to do to mess with this. This is just here to get things started. Okay, and then if we take a look at our pods, we'll see the Flux pods inside the cluster. So these 4 pods here are part of the Flux tooling, and there is documentation for each one of these controllers inside the Flux docs. But for now, for this purpose, we don't need to dive too deep into that. We just need to get Flux up and running. So now that we've gone through this step of the Flux configuration, we do have to pull those changes down. Okay, so now we have that configuration pulled in that we just created and pushed up. Okay, so we've gone through this stage. We have bootstrapped the cluster, or bootstrap Flux into the cluster. And now the next step is to start to tell Flux what sources we wanted to look at. And the source that we're going to use is going to be a Git repository, and it's going to be this Git repository. The Getting Started docs want you to use this a pod info image, and that works great, but I'm going to use this repository that we're currently in to make it a little more interesting. And so what this is going to do is we're going to use the URL of this Kubernetes kind demo repository. We're going to use the branch Flux demo. We're not using main. And the interval set is every 30 seconds. It's going to check for changes. And what you can also do is if you want to just see the output before writing it to a file, you can just export it out, see what it's going to look like before you actually commit to making anything. And so this is what the YAML is going to look like. It creates a Git repository object. It names it simple go. That looks like it's actually spelled incorrect, so we'll have to change that. And it puts it in the Flux system namespace. If we look at our pods, you can see that all of those Flux pods are in the Flux system namespace. And then we're setting up this Git repository object. Here's the URL we added, telling it where it lives, and then what branch we want it to point to. So this isn't telling it where inside the repository to look. It's just saying this is the repository, and this is the branch. That's all we're setting up at this point. But I do have to change that typo, which is got it. Okay, I'll paste this in, and this will create the YAML we need to set up the Git repository. We take a look. Here we created it, and here is everything that we saw. And we can actually commit this now and push it up. I'll just steal their commit message. Okay, so now the Git repository itself, that resource has been set up. And now we have to tell Flux where inside that repository to look for the customization files that the customization config YAML that it needs to actually deploy the pods. So they do provide a create method for that, a create command for that. I have my own, very similar, but the idea is we give it a target namespace of simple go, which we've been using. The source is simple go, and the path inside of the repository is the Kates directory, which we have here. And this is where our customization YAML lives. So that's where we want to point it to. The prune flag will tell Flux that whenever it does a deployment, to prune out any of the old resources. Anything that's no longer used, it can get rid of them. We don't need them anymore. And it's going to happen on a 5-minute interval. And it's going to output it to this YAML file. So we can run that. And that adds our customization YAML. And we can commit and push that up as well. Again, I'll just steal their commit message and push. Okay, now when this pushes, this should give us, it should deploy, Flux should pick it up and try to run our deployment. Okay, good. So it ran through and it picked up our config changes and it pushed, it rolled out our pods. So if we check out our pods, we have our Simple Go pod running here. And if all is working correctly, we should be able to curl that and get a response back. Good. So we have a response back. So Flux did pull in that configuration and deploy those pods for us. Now, what I'd like to do is change the image and push those config changes up, bump up the version of the image, and see if Flux picks it up. So what we can do is just change our output a little bit to test things. Change our log. And now build a new image. So I have the image build command right here. And we will just bump the version up to 1.0.1. That's good. Okay, there's our image. So it is built. And we do have to load this image into the cluster. And while that image is loading, we'll actually go and bump up the version in the deployment. So right now we're looking at 1.0. If we change it to 1.0.1, once this image loads, we can push these changes. Okay, good. The image is loaded. Somehow I got out of tmux. Okay, that makes sense. Okay, so now we want to push up. We want to commit this change and push it up. But before I push this up, what I'd like to do is monitor our pods and see if we can watch Flux redeploy the pods. Let's actually give it a namespace. Okay, so now we're just gonna watch our simple go pod. And push this up. Now, when we push, Flux should see the change and roll out the new image. Okay, so terminating the old pod, bringing up the new pod. The new pod is running. So now we should be able to curl the endpoint and get the new output. And now we have the Flux output. If we check the logs, where's our logs command? We should get the new log as well. Nice. So there's the Flux log. So this is the process that we can do to have. So we went through this phase of we configured Flux, bootstrapped it into the cluster. So it was sitting there running. And then once it's running, we pushed changes into our simple go config. We revved the version here to 1.0.1. The Flux recognized the change, and then it rolled those changes out to the pod. And I think the next step, maybe the next video I'll do, is taking a look at that, where it watches the image and checks for a new version and automatically does this config change for us. So we don't have to push this up. We can just push a new image tag, an image with a bumped tag to the image repository. The Flux will recognize that and then automatically update this config, which will then in turn do the rollover. And so that's it for this one.